required, but I do promise that funding isn't quite as dry and boring as it might sound at first. So I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, and I feel like I've already learned so much. So essentially, I'm Lee, and I'm working with the LGBTQI Community Foundation Give Out to develop and expand its world first LGBTQI climate fund, which we launched about a year ago today. So this is quite a nice sort of tie-up anniversary event as such. And we kind of really recognised that LGBTQI people were not being heard in the climate space. And really the events of the past year, the COVID pandemic, the intense and successive natural disasters that we've seen all over the world in the past year or two has just reinforced that. So as an organisation, Give Out works to bring new sources of funding into the global LGBTQI movement. We pull the donations we receive from our community and provide grants to organisations working in the global south and east, as that's where funding is normally most fragile and hard to come by. So, in doing so, we try and recognise that our communities are composed of individuals with multiple intersecting identities, and we do our best to be attentive to any barriers to participation in our global movement, whether that's due to gender, race, class, disability, location, or any other wide array of factors that make up the sort of individual diversity of our community. And overall, we're supporting about 30 organisations working across 5 continents. And it's honestly a privilege to learn from the expertise of activists working across such broad and varied contexts. As a funding organisation, we try our best to be proactive as well as responsive and work in partnership with grassroots movements to identify emerging opportunities and new needs in such rapidly changing local and global contexts. And we also try our best to pay attention to silences. We do our best to notice where LGBTQI voices aren't being heard in key spaces. And that's very much what happened in kind of our approach to the climate crisis and beginning to work in that area. So I think the other speakers have very powerfully highlighted this already, but we very much know that people who are marginalised are going to be especially vulnerable to climate change, and we've already seen that happen. But equally, we know that our community does create these networks of mutual aid. We are wonderful at supporting one another, often in the face of environments where, we lack legal recognition entirely. We can't access support schemes through the government. We might be excluded from emergency shelters that could be run by religious organisations or organisations that just don't accept LGBTQI people. And that is obviously a massive issue that's just going to be increasingly compounded as the climate crisis exacerbates all of these needs. So LGBTQI organisations and activists are very much working in this space already. I think Janine perfectly, illustrated that. But philanthropic knowledge and sort of attention to that intersection of LGBTQI rights and climate change is very scarce. It is, in fact, as scarce as the policy landscape. And that's why we've launched this climate fund. We're looking to kind of resource LGBTQI activists and organisations working to help tackle this crisis, and also to expand funding opportunities at that intersection through both grant making, but also philanthropic advocacy with other funders. So working to make them recognise that people are going to face compounding issues in the climate crisis. So it's important to direct funding to all sorts of different groups, including LGBTQI people. So at present, we've so far supported 3 organisations working on climate issues across 3 different countries. So in Jamaica, we've got JFLAG, which is Jamaica's leading LGBTQI organisation, and they're doing really fantastic work gathering data and authoring a report on the likely impact of the climate crisis on LGBTQI people. That's going to come out in the next few months, so I definitely recommend keeping an eye out for it when they publish it. And they have a wonderful consultant called Christie, who is really leading all that work, and they are just an absolutely fantastic climate activist with deep expertise. So absolutely go and check them out too. We are also working with the Equal Asia Foundation, which is a think tank, an innovations incubator working across Asia. And they're looking to kind of do capacity building, fill gaps. They're doing some great work on climate anxiety too, and looking at that intersection of mental health, LGBTQ identities, and climate. So really looking quite broadly. And finally, we've got the Tonga Ladies Association, who are based in Tonga, and obviously are currently preoccupied with the most recent disaster that they're facing. But they have historically had a lot of issues with their communities struggling to access shelters in these emergency situations due to discrimination. So they're really advocating for inclusion at a policy level on a national scale. So what we're really trying to do is engage with groups across a broad range of areas. And, you know, from a funding perspective, and from all of the things we've heard today and all the research, there seems to be sort of three key priorities that we're looking for. So we know that we need more data on the impacts of the climate crisis on LGBTQI people, so that we can justify the need to include us in policy interventions, but also just really empower organisations to be able to advocate for those things and understand what their communities might need. Because as we've heard, often we're so preoccupied by trying to exist in environments where LGBTQ identities are illegal or severely repressed that we're unable to even think about the long-term future of what happens in a crisis, because we are in crisis daily. And then secondly, we need to make sure that LGBTQI organisations can engage in local, national and international decision-making bodies. You know, we've heard about the disaster that was COP26 in Glasgow and how civil society organisations were very much excluded from the big discussion rooms. And this is obviously a very broad issue. So, you know, we need to make sure LGBTQ organisations can engage in those spaces and work with others to make sure that civil society is heard when tackling this crisis. And finally, and I think this really speaks to something that was raised in the chat earlier, there is a piece of work around supporting LGBTQI organisations to sort of learn about climate issues and engage with their communities, because what we've heard is that calls for things like homelessness, right? That's an existing issue for LGBTQI communities, but it's also a big climate adaptation and mitigation priority. So through being able to engage in that issue through both a human rights, economic justice and climate lens, it strengthens the overall call to improve that situation for LGBTQI people. So it might be the case that with the correct approach, organisations are able to sort of leverage climate funding and attention to climate in policy work to advocate for broader issues affecting LGBTQI communities, whether that's legal reform, economic inclusion, or homelessness even. So that's kind of our approach in a nutshell. You know, overall, we know that our community has an awful lot to contribute to the movement for climate justice, and we really want to honour our long history of collaborating with other movements. As funders, it's our responsibility to recognise gaps, support emerging needs, and work towards responsive and equitable models of funding, which work to correct power imbalance. And that's really never been more important. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to join you, and I'll really look forward to continuing the conversation later.